Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
Thomas Milton Aaron, Jr., Federico Alaniz, Jr., Steferino Alvarez, Jr., Charles Manuel Andujar, Roger Lee Barber, Ralph Anthony Barcelona, Frank Akeley Barker, Jr., Mark Frederick Biagini, Paul Joseph Bonetti, David George Brenner, Edgar Clarence Brown, Charles William Burkhart, Jr., James Billy Burton, Juan Hipólito Camargo, Walter John Carney, James Devon Carter, Wendell Lewell Carter, Franklin Delano Chopper, Donald Christie, Richard Rex Claxton, Michael James Clifford, Kenneth Lee Connor, John Dale Cook, Henry Eugene Copley, Jr., Dwayne Roger Cottingham, Donald Coleman Krotz, Frank Oscar Cuevas, James Lee Comiskey, John Charles Cupp, Jeffrey Lynn Dargan, Wayne Austin Decker, William Delly, Sidney Edward Denton, Donald Anthony DiSapio, Bernard W. Edwards, Jr., Stephen John Ellis, Stephen Paul Etherton, Gary Gene Evans, Jerry Roger Ferguson, Darrell Grant Francisco, Jeff Lee Franklin, Jr., William H. Gamble, Robert Louis Gardner, Charles Arthur Gaudreau, Donnie Adalbert Geerdes, George Gregory Gyrak, Jr., John Turner Glanville, Jr., Ambrosio Salazar Grandea, Richard Joseph Gray, Philip William Green, Jr., Edmund Jr. Greer, Gary Lynn Grimes, Don Lee Grisby, William Archie Gritz, Michael Anthony Gross, Teddy Earl Hargrove, Kenneth Ray Harris, Joseph D. Hayes, George Burns Hayes, Dennis Edward Heitner, Charles Lynn Hemingway, Theodore S. Harriot, Jr., Richard Lee Hogel, Willie Hoover, Jr.,
Clyde Richard Hauser, Jr., Richard Thomas Huget, Louis Eugene Hughes II, James Donald Jackson, James Lewis Jennings, William Arthur Johnson, Charles Howard Johnson, Jerry Hampton Johnson, Adrian Joseph Johnson, Jr., Everett Oscar Kerr, Arden Ellsworth Kersey, Jr., Stephen John Kinghorn, Franklin Joshua Krantz, Jr., Edward Arthur LaPierre, Joseph Stanley LeBay, Benny Richard Lambton, George Feodoro Lazar, Michael Keith Lewis, Daniel John Lepetsky, Norman Elliott Ludholm, Paul Nelson Loya, James Clifford Lucero, Donald Thomas Lutz, Alan Richard Lyman, James McConaughey, Jr., Franklin Delano McNary, Earl R. Michaels, Dennis Carl Miller, Gary Andrew Milton, Michael Howard Mobilia, James Robert Moore, Jr., Ronald Curtis Morden, Paul Richard Myers, Rudolph Algar Nunez, Thomas Earl Owens, Kenneth Oscar Palmer, Rudolph Parker, Christy Albert Peebler, Ascension Rosales Perez, Michael Leon Phillips, Roy Martin Ping, Ronald Dean Poole, Raul Ramos Jimenez, Robert Vincent Recker, Gary Lyle Richardson, James Ross Richmond, Jonathan Cecil Roker, James Douglas Rummel, Francisco Xavier Sayens, Arturo Salazar, Charles Anthony Sanchez, David Frank Schluterman, Wayne Gregory Scrimshaw, Craig Lee Seidel, Lawrence J. Silver, Donnie Ray Sizemore, Ralph R. Smith, Emery Morell Smith, Tommy Lee Smith, Joe Anthony Snitko, Porfirio Sam Solano, Byron Morrow Spear, Robert Lee Sproul, Gerald Kane Steele,
Clarence Moody Stoner, Jr., James Clellan Story, Milo Hershey Stratton, Coy Edward Strobel, Gary Lynn Taylor, Manuel Vega Torres, Thomas Harold Udegaard, Gary Leon Vantol, Henson Frank Walker, Forrest Edward Ward, Neil Clinton Ward, Alan Ray Weimer, Robert Wayne Worley, Gary Lee Westfall, Leonard Ray White, Thomas John Wilk, Ronald Alton Wilson, Charles Victor Wood, Henry Eugene Woolley, Carlos Avila Young, John Delbert Young, James Paul Young,